Well, good morning, everyone. It's Saturday, January the 21st, and time for what I hope will be a clarification for the week ahead. Some context for the work that some of you are already at work on. Before I get into my introduction to week 3, however, I want to share a poem with you that I wrote back in 2011. I told you at some point that I wrote poetry, and this one in particular, I think, relates to what this course is about. Its title is simply What, but it is a poetic effort to define poetry, which we're spending a lot of time with in this course. What is a poem? An explosion in a silent movie, muted, stretching to say more than can be said in a visual, incomplete, missing something, but somehow saying more. A rose from which the petals have fallen on the ground, somehow still connected, though fallen, still in the picture. A silent, long, and wordless sigh reaching deeper than yesterday. An acute angel of vision, seeing less but differently angled into insight, however personal and limited, and more. A word that stands alone, calling attention to its sound, discreet and personal, singing its own song for itself and others with ears to hear. An image starkly lighted yet private, inviting to those brave enough to hear or see or both. A scream on the edge of a bridge, the sky orange. Well, I'd be interested in your reactions to that. And now on to week 3. Perhaps the central theme of this course, the more I think about it, which I first expressed in my opening mini-lecture, revolves around the question of the relationship between culture and the arts, and which came first. If you remember, I said that relationship is one of those chicken and egg conundrums. Each gives birth to the other in a paradoxical kind of way that doesn't make sense, but is nonetheless a reality. I would add to that idea, however, that literature has another function. It has the additional value of allowing us to look at culture, to understand culture, even to shape culture, to express culture, and ultimately, in some foundational ways, to change culture. There are 2 quotations that I think help us to think about this important relationship and this important task of literature. The first is from Roger Scruton, an English philosopher and writer who specializes in aesthetics and political philosophy. He wrote, quote, "The culture of a civilization is the art and literature through which it rises to consciousness of itself and defines its vision of the world," end quote. The second is from Cynthia Ozick, an American novelist and short story writer who, in thinking about the same topic, said, quote, "Literature is an instrument of a culture, not a summary of it," end quote. So it is related to, but not the same as. It is connected with, but greater than. It is a lens by which we can consider ourselves and the world, the culture in which we live. In both of these quotations, the writers suggest a close relationship to culture, but also one that is critical and thoughtful about culture rather than a simple reflection of culture. It is a kind of self-reflection that allows a culture, or that assists a culture in self-understanding. I think the literature and art of the Harlem Renaissance provide abundant illustrations of this understanding. Not many periods in the history of the United States are more powerfully illustrative of the power of literature and the arts than this particular period, which we have come to call the Harlem Renaissance, although originally it was called the Negro Movement. I'll not go much into this phenomenon, since you are to read the introduction in the Norton Anthology anyway on pages 1265 to 1274. Those pages will tell you all and probably more than what you want to know. I've also included 3 video links, by the way. They're posted on Moodle, that I've chosen because they will let you see and hear this Renaissance much better than just read about it on a page or look at some black and white pictures. Since the Harlem Renaissance is a rebirth of all of the arts, music, dance, theater, painting, and sculpture, as well as literature, within the context of the African American experience, I really encourage you to watch them. They're quite short, but do an excellent job, I think, not only of explaining, but also of illustrating. The 2 points that I want to emphasize in this mini lecture are, first, that in many respects the Harlem Renaissance is the result of what is really, or was really, a forced migration out of the South to the North, and out of the largely rural and farm settings of the South into the primarily urban and city settings of the North. Because in a time when the economics and racism held the South, not exclusively, but most powerfully, in a very hard and unfriendly grasp, especially if you were black, which is largely why the Harlem Renaissance is nearly an exclusive explosion of African American arts and artists. That's the first point. Second is what is meant by the term Renaissance. On its most basic level, Renaissance comes from the Old French and means simply a rebirth, while it also can mean to grow anew. The term typically connects to a specific period in European history, from roughly the 14th to roughly the 17th centuries, when Europe experienced an explosion of development and insight and exploration of the world and artistic development, a new sense of liberation. This is the time of Chaucer and Shakespeare and Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Petrarch and John Donne and Machiavelli and Copernicus and Mozart and Galileo and Columbus and so on and so forth, to name only a few. However, the term also applies more broadly to any explosion of the arts. So, to quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Harlem Renaissance is a blossoming from roughly 1918 to roughly 1937 of the African American culture, particularly in the creative arts, and the most influential movement in African American literary history. Embracing literary, musical, theatrical, and visual arts, participants sought to reconceptualize the Negro, apart from the white stereotypes that had influenced black people's relationship to their heritage and to each other. They also sought to break free of Victorian moral values and bourgeois shame about aspects of their life that might, as seen by whites, reinforce racist beliefs. Never dominated by a particular school of thought, but rather characterized by intense debate, the movement laid the groundwork for all later African American literature and had an enormous impact on subsequent black literature and consciousness worldwide. While the Renaissance was not confined to the Harlem district of New York City, Harlem attracted a remarkable concentration of intellect and talent and served as the symbolic capital of this cultural awakening, in the quotation from the Britannica. And as the editors of your text point out, the influence of the Harlem Renaissance is not only on African American writers and artists, it also made enormous waves in both the black urban community and the whole world of art. Therefore, pretty clearly, this was a true Renaissance. Our discussion questions for this week focus on the Harlem Renaissance. The readings are from writers who were key leaders and poets of this period. In addition to the introduction and the videos about the Harlem Renaissance that I've added, I'm asking you to choose just one of these writers. Focus in on that person. Spend some real pay attention time to what and how this writer speaks. As you frame your answers to the questions raised for discussion, I encourage you to use the poet you chose to engage at least as part of your response. Now, looking ahead, I need to say a few things that I will say much more about later. I will soon be sending you some direction about the next 2 weeks, especially for week 5, because this calls the work in week 5 calls for teamwork. The teams are already assigned, and I will soon mail to you directions on how to get together and what you are to produce as a team. The work in week 4, which I'll say more about later as well, is really a kind of preparation for that final presentation. So watch for the directions for these 2 related processes. Again, about your engagement with the discussion. I find myself quite often challenged by your thinking about the work, enjoying being challenged by your thinking about the work you're asked to do. So thanks again for your good, thoughtful work. I always look forward to sitting down to my laptop and discovering the insights that you have over this very rich material that we're working with. Blessings on your journey. I'll be in touch.